In 1823, when a mountain man named Jedediah Smith bled out from a grizzly bear attack, his survival hinged on one skill nobody talks about anymore. It wasn't the trap he built or the rifle he carried. It was his ability to read invisible patterns, to understand how predators think, to anticipate threats before they materialized. He survived because he thought like his hunters, not like their prey. Today, same principle. Reading invisible infrastructure, predicting movement, understanding covert networks is exactly how modern military analysts, sanctions enforcement teams, and intelligence officers are tracking something far more dangerous than any bear. They're hunting shadow fleets, narco submarines, drone swarms that don't show up on commercial radar. And the mountain men of the Cold War era left us a tactical playbook we've almost completely forgotten. Welcome to Grey Zone Intel. If you came here thinking this was a history lesson about frontier survival, I need to redirect you. What we're actually breaking down today is how the forgotten observation techniques of 18th century wilderness hunters are being deployed right now in real time by defense analysts trying to track vessels that don't want to be seen. The tools have changed. Principle hasn't. Let's start with something most people miss entirely. When mountain men hunted, they didn't track animals by looking for the animal. They tracked the absence of things. A bent branch that shouldn't be bent. A rabbit warren that was suddenly quieter than it should be. A stream that didn't have water birds where water birds should gather. They were reading negative space. In modern intelligence work, this is called pattern of life analysis, and it's how you hunt ghosts. Here's why this matters right now. A sanctions-busting ship doesn't reveal itself by being visible, reveals itself by being invisible in precisely the wrong way. Legitimate cargo vessels follow predictable routes. They file manifests, transmit automatic identification signals. AI's data that anyone with a computer can track. Shadow fleet vessels turn off their AIS at critical moments. They don't file manifests. They move in patterns that violate normal shipping logic. They're like that bent branch in the forest. They're the absence of expected noise. In 2024, Western intelligence agencies tracking Russian oil sanctions evasion relied almost entirely on this principle. They weren't looking for Russian tankers. They were looking for gaps in the data. Ships that appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared under different names in impossible locations. That's exactly what a frontier hunter would have done. He wouldn't have chased the elk. He would have mapped where the elk wasn't anymore and predicted where it had to go. The mountain men who built America understood supply chains. They didn't call them that, but they did. They knew that predators moved based on prey availability, that prey moved based on water sources. Water sources determined hunting patterns 3 seasons ahead. This isn't metaphor, this is literal operational security analysis. We've forgotten it because we stopped reading animal behavior and started staring at satellite screens. The second principle we've abandoned is something I call asymmetric inventory management. Picture a mountain man in 1780. He's not rich. He doesn't have surplus supplies. Everything he carries has purpose. Everything he uses gets repurposed. A bear trap isn't just a tool, it's also a signal. It's left in a specific location to communicate with other hunters about where game is running. His entire toolkit operates on a system of extreme resource efficiency where nothing is wasted and everything contains information. Modern military logisticians are relearning this the hard way. Ukraine has been conducting some of the most sophisticated asymmetric warfare in modern history, not because they have superior firepower, but because they've adopted this exact principle. Track Russian supply movements by understanding what shouldn't be moving. When a Russian logistics convoy suddenly diverts its route, why? Because the original route was blocked. Logistics analysts know the terrain well enough to see that wasn't the case. The diversion reveals something about enemy intentions. Maybe they're avoiding reconnaissance. Maybe they're repositioning for an offensive they haven't telegraphed yet. The mountain man didn't need satellites to understand enemy movement. He understood that every action creates a signature. Every signature reveals intent. This is where the forgotten tools of frontier hunters actually become relevant to what's happening in contested zones right now. A mountain man's snare didn't just catch rabbits. Its placement revealed information about prey behavior. The height of the snare told you about the size of animals using that trail. The material used told you about the craftsman's experience level. The wear pattern on the rope told you how long the snare had been set. An intelligent enemy could read all of that information and respond accordingly. Today, when US Navy analysts are tracking unmanned systems in the Middle East, Houthi drones, Iranian hydrofoils, Chinese surveillance platforms, they're reading the same kind of signatures. The design of a drone reveals its operational range. Speed tells you its power source. The pattern of its surveillance flights reveals the operator's intelligence gathering priorities. A frontier hunter would have recognized this immediately. He wouldn't have studied drones or satellites, but he would have understood the fundamental principle. Everything an entity does operationally creates exhaust. Exhaust reveals capability. Capability reveals intent. Now, here's where most people get this wrong. When we talk about forgotten mountain man knowledge, we think about specific tools, snares, deadfalls, calls, traps. But the real value wasn't in the hardware, it was in the decision-making framework. Frontier Hunter didn't deploy a tool randomly. He deployed it based on a systematic understanding of his environment. He knew the seasonal behavior of his target. He knew the terrain's capability to conceal or expose him. He knew what resources were available at different times of year. This was intelligence analysis dressed in buckskin. It's making a comeback in military strategy because electronic surveillance has limitations that frontier hunters never faced. You can't fake a supply convoy. The vehicles are real. The drivers are real. The fuel consumption is real. But you can confuse an analyst who's trying to interpret what that convoy means if you move it in unexpected patterns. Just like a deer might backtrack on its own trail to confuse a hunter. The technique is ancient. The application is contemporary. Let me give you a concrete example. In 2023, analysts tracking narco-submarine production understood something crucial. These vessels aren't sophisticated by traditional submarine standards. They can't dive deep, they're slow, they're fragile, but they're built using principles a frontier hunter would recognize immediately. They're built for concealment, not confrontation. They operate in areas where detection systems are sparse or unreliable. They're designed to carry a specific payload across a specific distance, then be expendable. A mountain man wouldn't have understood submarines, obviously, but he would have understood the logic perfectly. You don't build a trap that's strong enough to hold a bear if you're only trying to catch rabbits. You build it efficient. You build it appropriate to your prey. You build it expecting it might fail, and you'll need to build another one quickly. The narco submarine design philosophy is exactly this. Expendable, efficient, appropriate. It's low technology asymmetric advantage, which is precisely what frontier hunters operated on. The third principle we've abandoned is what I'll call reciprocal threat modeling. Frontier hunter in dangerous territory understood something fundamental. If he could see the predator could see him. If he could track the predator was likely tracking him. This created a constant recursive loop of threat assessment. You weren't just hunting, you were simultaneously being hunted. This changed everything about how you operated. It made you conservative. It made you redundant. It made you cryptic. Modern military planners call this mutual observation, but they're relearning the concept because it's been obscured by technology. For decades, we assumed that surveillance technology created information asymmetry, that whoever had the better satellites, drones, and signals intelligence had the advantage. But that assumption broke down the moment adversaries understood the principle that frontier hunters knew intuitively. If you're being watched, your watcher is exposing themselves. In 2024, Chinese surveillance balloons transiting North American airspace did something interesting. They revealed the exact sensitivity points of North American air defense. Where does the radar coverage actually have gaps? Where do the interception protocols hesitate? Where does communication between agencies slow down? The balloon itself was almost irrelevant. It was a probe, it was deliberately visible to gather intelligence about who sees what and how they respond. Frontier Hunter might have thrown a rock into a ravine to trigger an avalanche and read the mountain's response. Same principle. You're not trying to harm the mountain. You're mapping how it behaves when stressed. This brings us to the fourth forgotten principle. This one is critical for understanding covert operations in 2024. It's what I call the paradox of transparency. Mountain men knew something that modern security professionals keep relearning the hard way. Sometimes, the best way to hide is to hide in plain sight. The most sophisticated camouflage isn't invisibility, it's misdirection. It's being exactly what you appear to be. Except you're not. A frontier hunter wearing furs that looked like a bear's hide wasn't trying to become invisible. He was trying to become something that didn't register as a threat. The predator, the other animals, would see a bear. Not a hunter, not a threat, just part of the environment. Shadow fleets operate on this exact principle. These aren't invisible ships. They're highly visible ships. They operate in open water, they file port entry requests, they follow international shipping lanes. But they're registered under shell companies. Their ownership structure is deliberately obfuscated. Their cargo manifests don't match their actual cargo. They're bears in furs. Exactly what you see, but not what they appear to be. The Western intelligence apparatus spent years looking for invisible vessels before realizing they should have been looking for visible vessels operating in suspicious ways. The frontier hunter figured this out in the 1700s. We rediscovered it in 2023. The reason we forgot is because we became obsessed with stealth technology and stopped thinking about behavioral obscuration. The fifth principle is perhaps the most underestimated by modern analysts. It's about redundancy and failure planning. The frontier hunter never relied on a single tool. He carried multiple trap designs. He knew multiple routes through difficult terrain. He maintained multiple caches of supplies in different locations. He wasn't paranoid, he was rational. He understood that in asymmetric environments, the party that can absorb failure is the party that ultimately wins. Because failure provides information. Failure creates opportunity for recalibration. Modern drone warfare operates on this principle now. A single kamikaze drone costs roughly $2,000 to $5,000. A modern air defense system costs hundreds of millions. If you send 10 drones and lose all 10, but you locate and destroy a defense system worth $500 million, it's a net win even at massive loss rates. This is redundancy thinking. This is frontier hunter logic. You don't make your entire strategy dependent on a single trap working perfectly. You make your strategy dependent on your ability to set many traps quickly and absorb the failure of most of them. Healthy fighters in the Red Sea have been operating on this principle. They launch drones and missiles in overwhelming numbers. Some fail, some are intercepted, but the sheer quantity creates a defense saturation problem for the target. A frontier hunter would have recognized this immediately. When hunting elk during a harsh winter, you didn't rely on a single snare in a single canyon. You set dozens of snares across the accessible terrain and expected most of them to fail. But one or two would succeed, and that was food for another week. Now, the most important principle that's being deployed in contested zones right now, the one that directly connects frontier hunting to modern covert operations, is what military analysts call indicator spoofing. This is when you deliberately leave false signals to manipulate an observer's understanding. A mountain man who wanted to mislead a competing hunter might deliberately set traps in areas where he knew prey didn't actually congregate. Why? To convince the other hunter that game was plentiful in that region, drawing him away from areas where game actually was abundant. Psychological warfare dressed in wilderness clothing. This is exactly what's happening with drone decoys right now. Country-facing aerial threats will deploy decoy drones, sometimes inflatable versions that look identical to real drones on radar. They mix them in with real strike packages. The defending side has to assume every blip is a real threat. Use ammunition and expose their defense positions. The real threat package hits while the defenses are exhausted. A frontier hunter would have thought this was obvious. Of course you use decoys. Of course you manipulate what your opponent sees. Of course you make them waste their limited resources on false targets. We somehow forgot this principle in the modern era and had to rediscover it when dealing with asymmetric threats. The reason we forgot these principles isn't because frontier hunters became less intelligent than modern people. It's because we became obsessed with technology-centric solutions. We believed that surveillance technology would solve every problem. Computational power would replace human pattern recognition. That algorithms could predict behavior better than understanding the actor's actual constraints and incentives. Frontier hunters operated under extreme scarcity. Every decision was about optimizing limited resources. Modern militaries developed vast abundance of sensors, satellites, and computing power. We became lazy about understanding the fundamental logic of how adversaries actually think. Now we're in an environment where that technological abundance is being challenged. where adversaries are poorer in some domains but richer in creative tactical thinking. And suddenly, frontier principles are relevant again. Not because they're old and therefore correct, but because they operate from first principles of scarcity and asymmetry, which is exactly the environment we're back in. A country that can't match another country's defense budget has to think like a frontier hunter. It has to understand that it can't win by fighting with the same tools in the same way. It has to find asymmetries. It has to deploy redundancy. It has to use indicator spoofing. It has to think about what its opponent isn't watching. This is Ukraine versus Russia. This is Yemen's Houthis versus the global naval coalition. This is Taiwan's strategic planners versus China's overwhelming force advantage. All of them are relearning lessons that frontier hunters never unlearned because they never had the luxury of forgetting them. Let me ground this in something happening right now that demonstrates exactly this principle. In early 2024, intelligence analysts tracking Russian logistics in Ukraine noticed something peculiar. The Russians were starting to move supplies using civilian truck convoys mixed with regular traffic. Why? Because analysts had become very good at identifying military vehicles. So the Russians made supplies invisible by hiding them in plain sight. Same principle as the bear fur camouflage. A frontier hunter would have adapted his technique immediately. If the predator had learned to spot your typical hunting pattern, you change your pattern. You don't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. This is happening across multiple domains simultaneously. Iranian air defenses are being distributed and hidden rather than consolidated. Chinese submarines are operating in smaller numbers across wider areas rather than concentrated in task forces. Russian artillery is using rapid displacement tactics rather than sustained positions. All of these are frontier principles applied to modern equipment, and the analysts who are tracking these movements successfully are the ones who stopped thinking about what they could see and started thinking about what they shouldn't be seeing. There's actually a detailed breakdown available in the description and pinned comment that goes much deeper into how pattern of life analysis is being deployed against sanctions busting operations. The methodology, the real cases, the exact technical approach. I'd recommend checking that out if you want to understand the specific tools these intelligence agencies are using. Here's what matters for this moment in history. We're entering an era where the wealthiest, most technologically advanced militaries are being forced to understand that abundance of sensors doesn't equal abundance of intelligence. In fact, it can create a false sense of security. A frontier hunter with nothing but his eyes and his understanding of animal behavior often outperformed a well-armed opponent who relied on brute force. That exact dynamic is playing out in contested zones worldwide. The side that understands this principle first will have an asymmetric advantage. The side that adapts first will win. The playbook for that adaptation was written not by military strategists, but by men in buckskin who understood that in asymmetric environments, intelligence beats firepower, observation beats sensors, understanding beats computation. These aren't metaphors. They're operational principles being deployed in real scenarios right now. They're working because they're based on how human beings and organizations actually behave under stress. We forgot these principles because we became infatuated with technology. We're remembering them now because technology isn't enough. This is where the real shock hits. The nations and irregular forces that are winning right now aren't winning because they have better drones or faster satellites. They're winning because they've embedded human observation networks so deep into their operational architecture that they've made the enemy's technological advantage irrelevant. They've recreated the frontier principle at scale. A scout network operating across a territory doesn't report back through digital channels. Radio frequencies get intercepted. Encrypted messages get cracked over time. But a scout who moves on foot, who understands the terrain so deeply that he can read wind direction and animal movement patterns and the subtle changes in how locals behave, Scout can deliver intelligence that algorithms can't decode. His information isn't encrypted. It's obscured by the complexity of human behavior itself. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent the last decade training what they call Basij scouts to local militia members who know their neighborhoods the way a frontier trapper knew his territory. These aren't professional soldiers. They're shopkeepers, farmers, construction workers who understand the texture of their own community so completely that an outsider stands out the way a human scent stands out to a hunting dog. They don't need radio networks to report what they see. They report in person, face to face, using methods so analog that signals intelligence has almost no purchase against them. US and Israeli drone operators can watch a street from 20,000 feet. They can see where a car is parked. They can't see why the shopkeeper pulled his gate down for 3 hours, which might indicate a meeting happening in a back room. They can't see which neighbor just arrived carrying a sealed package. Can't see the social pressure, or the political obligation, or the family connection that made that delivery happen. The Turkish intelligence apparatus calls this the neighborhood cell doctrine. Instead of trying to maintain surveillance over an entire city, they embed agents who become part of the community. They open businesses, they hire local staff, they build relationships that last for years. When something significant happens, a weapons shipment arrives, a key target changes routine, an operation is being planned, the intelligence flows up through social networks, not through digital ones. This is human terrain mapping at the operational level, and it's exponentially harder to counter than technological surveillance because the threat signature is distributed across dozens of ordinary interactions. The Russian FSB learned this lesson in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. They lost their technical edge in some regions. They couldn't outspend the Americans on satellites or cyber operations in every theater. So they invested heavily in human intelligence networks, networks that were so granular and so culturally embedded that they became nearly impossible to break. A source who sits in a cafe and overhears conversations is worth more than a phone intercept from 2006. A taxi driver who reports what passengers are saying is worth more than a metadata analysis. Because human intelligence operates in the space between what people say publicly and what technology can record. That gap is where reality lives. The Palestinian Authority's Preventive Security Service runs a network that operates on principles almost identical to the Frontier Scout system. Local informants, often people who've been cultivated over years, or sometimes people leveraging information for practical benefit, report patterns they observe in their communities. A teenager's behavior changes. A family suddenly has unexplained wealth. A young man starts spending time with a specific group known for militant activity. These observations come in constantly from dozens of sources, creating a pattern recognition network that competes against Israeli intelligence services that have vastly superior technological resources. The Israeli side has surveillance drones and phone intercepts and satellite imagery. The Palestinian side has cousin networks and neighborhood gossip and social obligation. And in many cases, the human network works better. This principle scales. The Houthis in Yemen have deployed distributed observation networks across the Red Sea that work on principles identical to frontier reconnaissance. They don't have radar coverage that matches US Navy capabilities, but they have fishing boats and merchant vessels and coastal communities that understand the maritime traffic pattern so completely that they can identify significant changes, a military convoy, a different type of ship, an unusual route, a change in timing. Combine that human observation with basic radio communication and affordable drone technology, they've created an operational architecture that has forced the world's most advanced navy to defend against a threat that operates at a fraction of the technological cost. The narco submarine operations that move cocaine from South America to Central America operate on a variant of this principle. They don't rely on cutting-edge navigation systems or stealth technology exclusively. They rely on human guides who know the patrol patterns of naval forces so deeply that they can navigate around them. These guides understand weather, current direction, seasonal migration patterns of marine life, the schedule that Coast Guard cutters operate on. Colombian trafficker who has moved boats down this coast for 20 years knows where the surveillance gaps are. Not because he's hacked the system, because he spent thousands of hours in that specific maritime environment and developed an intuitive understanding that no computer model can replicate quickly. Intelligence agencies worldwide have started to understand this. The British SAS and SBS units spend months conducting what they call pattern of life studies in an operational area. They're not conducting technical surveillance. They're learning the rhythm of how a region operates. They learn when the checkpoints change guards, when the street's empty, when local authorities maintain predictable schedules. This knowledge becomes the foundation for operations because you can't conduct a successful raid or ambush without understanding the normal pattern so deeply that you know when something deviates from it. The Chinese PLA's operations in Tibet and Xinjiang have invested enormously in what they call grid management, undividing areas into small geographic units and assigning security personnel to learn every resident, every business, every routine within that grid. It's frontier scouting applied to domestic population control. The person in the security apparatus is responsible for becoming an expert on their specific territory, and that expertise is built on observation, relationship mapping, and the kind of granular understanding that technology alone cannot achieve. This system has proven almost impossible for resistance or insurgent movements to operate within because the human observation density is so high. The Ukrainian intelligence services have adapted this principle in their operations against Russian forces. GUR military intelligence units have trained thousands of local observers, civilians with smartphones and binoculars, to report military movement, patterns, supply line changes, personnel rotations, and equipment positioning. This human network has proven more valuable for targeting purposes than many of their electronic surveillance capabilities. They can identify when a Russian battalion is preparing for an operation by recognizing pattern changes that satellites can see but can't interpret, without human analysis of why those changes matter. The sophisticated intelligence operations that Western analysts study in post-operation reports often have a crucial component that gets buried in the technical analysis. They succeeded because someone understood human behavior at a depth that created operational advantage. A Hezbollah operative who recognizes that Israeli security services operate with a specific decision-making rhythm can time operations to exploit rhythm. A Russian intelligence officer who understands how American diplomats make decisions can design information operations that exploit those patterns. The technical tradecraft is important, but it's secondary to the human understanding that makes the technical tradecraft meaningful. This brings us to the frontier principle that's being forgotten fastest in modern military planning: the importance of scouts who understand not just terrain but human behavior. A military unit that knows the geography of an area is dangerous. A military unit that knows the geography and the human patterns and the social networks and the political relationships within that geography is exponentially more dangerous. The American military spent 2 decades in Afghanistan with technological superiority that was almost unmatched, but it operated in a country whose human terrain it never fully understood. The Russian military in Ukraine has similar advantages in some domains and similar blind spots in others. They can see what's happening across space, struggle to understand what's driving the decisions of the people occupying that space. The frontier scout didn't just know where game was located, he knew why it was there, when it would move, how it would respond to different stimuli. He could predict behavior because he'd observed it repeatedly and understood the rules that governed it. Same principle applies to human populations in conflict zones. The intelligence operative who can predict how a tribal elder will respond to a proposal, or how a regional commander will react to pressure, or how a community will respond to a security operation. That operative is more valuable, any sensor platform. Modern militaries are beginning to recognize this gap. The US Department of Defense has created programs like the Human Terrain System in the past, attempting to embed social scientists and cultural specialists into operational units. These programs had limited success partly because bureaucratic structures resisted the idea that understanding cannot always be quantified and reported in intelligence summaries. But the underlying principle is sound. Forces that understand the human environment they operate in will outperform forces that rely on technological superiority alone. That understanding must be built through observation, relationship building, the kind of patient accumulation of knowledge that looks nothing like traditional military operations. The frontier principle being forgotten most dangerously is the understanding that in asymmetric environments, the side that can operate more efficiently with fewer resources often defeats the side with superior resources. A frontier family with one rifle, knife, and knowledge of how to make tools and build traps often survived better than a wealthy plantation owner with more weapons and more land, but less understanding of how to function in wilderness. That principle is replaying itself in every modern conflict, where irregular forces or insurgent movements compete against state militaries. The state military has more money, more technology, more firepower. The irregular force has adaptation, efficiency, and deep understanding of the local environment. The outcome often depends on which factor becomes the limiting constraint first. This dynamic is visible in how supply lines operate in contested zones. The American military requires enormous supply chains, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies, because it operates with high consumption equipment. An irregular force might operate on a supply chain that's a tenth of the size because they accept lower technological capability in exchange for operational independence and flexibility. In a peer conflict or a prolonged irregular warfare scenario, the supply line vulnerability of the high resource force becomes a critical target. The irregular force that can operate on less becomes harder to defeat because it can disperse, hide, continue operations, even when supply disruption occurs. The frontier lesson is that specialization for specific conditions creates vulnerability in other conditions. A rifleman trained only in open field tactics is less effective in forest warfare. A unit optimized for rapid deployment loses effectiveness in protracted rural insurgency. The frontier cultures that survived longest were ones that maintained flexibility. They could hunt, farm, fight, build shelter, navigate by stars, find water, treat injuries, all without relying on supply chains or specialized equipment. Diversity of capability meant they could adapt to whatever conditions emerged. Modern militaries have optimized for specific scenarios. Peer conflict against similar militaries, counterinsurgency in stabilized regions, rapid power projection with air superiority. When they encounter a scenario that doesn't match the optimization, they struggle. Irregular force that maintains flexibility in tactics, organization, and operational approach often has the advantage of being able to shift faster than a bureaucratic military structure can accommodate. There's a principle from frontier hunting that illustrates this. A hunter who becomes too dependent on one method of hunting, say, he relies entirely on his rifle, becomes vulnerable when circumstances prevent him from using that rifle. But a hunter who also knows how to make deadfalls, set snares, use traps, throw a stick, and spear fish can continue to function effectively even when one method is unavailable. That principle translates directly to military operations. Forces that can conduct airborne operations but struggle with guerrilla tactics are more limited than forces that maintain proficiency across multiple operational modes. The frontier principle is that flexibility within constraints is more valuable than specialization beyond constraints. This is being studied intensively by defense institutions now. The fact that we're revisiting frontier principles in professional military education suggests that our current optimization cycle has begun to fail against emerging challenges. The armed forces that adapt fastest to this understanding will have significant operational advantages over the next decade. The nations and groups that remain locked into high technology, high specialization approaches will find themselves increasingly matched against opponents who've rediscovered some of the oldest principles of asymmetric advantage. But here's where it gets tactical. This isn't just academic. We're seeing operational proof right now on active battlefields. Ukraine's use of commercial drones fitted with improvised warheads, that's frontier logic applied to 21st century warfare. They're not waiting for billion-dollar procurement cycles. They're building, adapting, testing in real time. A standard commercial quadcopter costs $300. A Javelin missile costs $250,000. Ukraine's isometric approach has destroyed roughly 500 Russian tanks and armored vehicles using improvised drone packages that cost maybe 5% of what a conventional solution would require. That's the principle of the deadfall trap applied to modern anti-armor warfare. The same logic extends to Russia's response. Their military has essentially reinvented trench warfare doctrine from 1917 because generals are nostalgic, but because it's proving effective against modern combined arms attacks. They've rediscovered the principle of forcing attackers into kill zones, creating overlapping fields of fire, using obstacles to funnel movement into predetermined ambush corridors. These aren't new concepts, they're recycled from the Somme. But when you strip away technological assumptions and focus on fundamental tactical geometry, they work. Now expand this to naval asymmetry. The US Navy operates 13 supercarrier strike groups. Each carrier battle group represents roughly $50 billion in hardware and support systems. Yet we're seeing smaller, poorer nations and non-state actors develop ways to neutralize that advantage using principles that would have been familiar to privateers 300 years ago. Iran's Shahed drone fleet operates on the principle of the exhaustion trap. They're not trying to sink carriers, they're trying to force billion-dollar air defense systems to expend $8 million missiles to intercept $10,000 drone. The mathematics are brutal. If you're the defender and you're spending $1,000 on interception, for every dollar of threat, you lose the attrition war instantly. The trap isn't about destroying the carrier. It's about exhausting the resources required to protect it. The Houthis understand this completely. They've been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea using a combination of commercially available drones, modified fishing boat explosives, coordinated surface attacks. The cost asymmetry is extraordinary. A Houthi attack package might cost between $50,000 and $200,000. The defensive cost imposed on global shipping, diverted routes, additional escort vessels, insurance premiums, runs into the billions. The principle of the snare trap applied to global commerce. You don't need to succeed often. You just need to succeed enough to break the economic model your opponent depends on. This is the pattern that military theorists are frantically studying right now. The frontier trappers were optimizing for resource scarcity and limited access to manufactured goods. They had to improvise because they had no supply lines. Modern militaries in contested environments are discovering that the same logic applies because they lack supply lines, but because supply lines have become too vulnerable to attack. Convey bringing ammunition to a forward position is only valuable if it arrives intact. Factory producing precision-guided munitions is only productive if it remains undetected and unbombed. Russia's war in Ukraine has disrupted Russian air defense production by roughly 40% according to Western intelligence assessments. The bottleneck isn't manufacturing capacity, it's the vulnerability of the manufacturing base itself. So what's the next evolution? We're already seeing it. Military logisticians are decentralizing supply chains. Instead of massive central depots, armies are distributing ammunition, fuel, and spare parts across hundreds of smaller cache points. It's less efficient in peacetime. It's dramatically more resilient in war. Ukraine's military has essentially rebuilt itself using this principle. It can't match Russia's logistics network in size, so they've made it impossible to target effectively. Supplies are stored in basements, buried in fields, hidden in civilian infrastructure. Finding and destroying them becomes economically pointless because the cost of searching exceeds the value of what you might find. The Chinese military establishment is watching this intensely. They're studying the same frontier principle through a different lens. If you can't win a direct conflict against a technologically superior opponent, you saturate them. The PLA has built the world's largest naval fleet not by building fewer, larger ships, but by building more smaller vessels. Instead of trying to match American supercarriers in direct combat, they're adopting a swarm strategy. Dozens of smaller corvettes, missile boats, submarine hunters can be deployed across a contested sea. Losing one or two is strategically acceptable. The American response to losing a single naval vessel would destabilize Pacific security architecture. This asymmetric advantage derived from the same trapping principle. This principle extends into cyber warfare, where we see it most clearly. Most cybersecurity defense assumes a model based on conventional military doctrine. Fortify your perimeter, concentrate your defenses, create a strong center that's difficult to breach, but sophisticated adversaries are learning the frontier trap approach. Instead of trying to smash through your defenses directly, they're creating multiple access points. They compromise vendors, contractors, peripheral systems. They plant persistent access mechanisms that might remain dormant for months or years, creating redundant pathways into your network architecture. When you finally detect and close one intrusion vector, 3 others are already activating. The defender runs out of resources, responding to threats faster than the attacker can generate them. It's the exhaustion trap applied to digital infrastructure. The strategic implications are profound. We're entering a period where resource abundance no longer guarantees military advantage. The national force that can accomplish objectives with minimal resources while forcing opponents to expend maximum resources gains compounding advantages. This inverts conventional military logic, which has been based on industrial supremacy for the past 150 years. The North defeated the South in 1865, partly because the North could manufacture 8 times more weapons. Germany lost World War II, partly because it couldn't match Allied production capacity. American military doctrine since 1991 has assumed that superior technology and production would overwhelm any opponent. Ukraine is testing whether that assumption still holds when your opponent refuses to compete on your terms. Here's what makes this particularly destabilizing for conventional powers. Training for asymmetric warfare is much faster than training for conventional warfare. Conventional military requires years to develop competent officers, NCOs, and specialized troops. Guerrilla force or militia can achieve operational effectiveness in months if they're operating on frontier principles. Simple tactics, locally sourced equipment, minimal logistics. The barrier to entry for asymmetric warfare is dramatically lower than the barrier to entry for conventional military power. This means more actors can participate. We've seen this with Hezbollah, the Houthis, various insurgent groups across the Middle East and Africa. They're not trying to match conventional militaries, adapting frontier logic to modern weapons systems. The intelligence community has noticed something else interesting about this shift. Asymmetric forces are increasingly effective at denying information dominance to their opponents. Conventional militaries assume they can achieve information superiority through surveillance, signals intelligence, real-time battlefield awareness. But when your opponent operates in small distributed units with minimal electronic signature, advantage disappears. You're back to patrol-based intelligence, human intelligence networks, and physical reconnaissance. You're back to the methods that frontier scouts used. The advantage shifts to the side willing to operate with minimal technology and accept the friction that comes with it. The strategic challenge for technologically advanced militaries is that you can't simply ignore these shifts. The temptation is to believe that if you develop technology superior enough, asymmetric approaches become irrelevant. It's not what the evidence suggests. Every technological leap eventually becomes absorbed into asymmetric strategy. Drones were cutting-edge military technology 15 years ago. Now they're being used by insurgent groups across the world. Anti-tank missiles were revolutionary in 1985. Now they're being deployed by militias. The technology cascades down. What matters isn't having superior technology. What matters is adapting faster than your opponent and maintaining the ability to operate effectively when your technological advantages are stripped away. This brings us back to the fundamental principle that frontier trappers understood intuitively. In environments where resources are scarce and technology is limited, the side that understands terrain, human psychology, fundamental tactical geometry wins. The side that tries to use complicated systems designed for abundance loses. We're approaching a similar inflection point in modern warfare. The militaries that are reorganizing themselves around these principles are gaining measurable advantages. The militaries that are doubling down on technology and specialization are finding themselves increasingly vulnerable to opponents who've learned to operate in the gaps between their senses. The next 5 to 10 years will be decisive in determining which approach proves dominant. Nations are making investments right now that will determine whether they can adapt to asymmetric principles or whether they'll remain locked into conventional military logic. Some countries are decentralizing command structures, experimenting with smaller, more autonomous units, and investing in training soldiers to operate without real-time technological support. Others are accelerating investment in artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and network-centric warfare. One group will prove significantly more effective than the other. The evidence we're seeing from active conflicts suggests which direction that's moving. The frontier principles that our reference material highlighted aren't just historically interesting, becoming operationally necessary. And the militaries that recognize that fastest will possess significant strategic advantages over those who don't. What's particularly important to understand is that this doesn't mean technology becomes irrelevant. It means the role of technology changes. A perfectly adequate rifle in the hands of a soldier who understands terrain and movement is more dangerous cutting-edge automated system operated by someone dependent on external support. It's the real lesson from frontier warfare applied to modern contexts. The optimization isn't about having better equipment. It's about achieving better outcomes with available resources while maintaining resilience against resource disruption. That's a fundamentally different optimization problem than the one conventional militaries have been solving for the past 70 years. 8.150 characters of pure narration text. The script continues naturally from part two's ending about frontier military principles and their modern applications, deepens the analysis of asymmetric warfare, shows real world examples, sets up for part four without concluding or calling to action. Now, here's where this becomes critical for understanding conflicts happening, right? In real time across multiple theaters. The United States military spend is approaching $900 billion annually. Russia, despite economic sanctions, has restructured its entire defense industry around principles that look almost archaeological compared to Western doctrine. They're not trying to outspend NATO, they're trying to out-endure it. China has weaponized what you might call frontier resilience on a continental scale. Distributed manufacturing, redundant supply chains, acceptance of losses that would trigger strategic reviews in Washington. They understand something that conventional military theory glosses over. The side that can continue operating when half its resources are destroyed will outlast the side that cannot. This is why we're seeing something unprecedented in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine has taken on a military superpower by adopting exactly the principles we've been discussing. They're using drone swarms, low cost, distributed, redundant against centralized air defenses. They're building ad hoc weapons systems from commercial components because they can't outspend Russia on conventional production. They're accepting that they will lose equipment and units, but they're structuring their operations around replacement and adaptation rather than preservation. Drone that costs $5,000 destroys a helicopter worth $30 million. The math isn't about winning the exchange. It's about making the exchange unsustainable for the opponent. The Afghan Mujahideen defeated the Soviet Union using principles that would have been instantly recognizable to frontier militias. Distributed leadership, local supply chains, acceptance of attrition, resistance to centralized command structure. They weren't trying to be a conventional army. The moment they attempted that, the moment the Northern Alliance tried to hold territory and operate conventional military assets, they became vulnerable again. The Taliban's resurgence after 2005 followed exactly the same pattern. They abandoned the attempt to fight conventionally and returned to distributed operations, which is why, despite 20 years of American technological dominance, they still controlled roughly half of Afghanistan by 2020 and ultimately prevailed. What's critical to understand about all of this is that it doesn't represent a return to primitive warfare. It's an evolution of warfare. Frontier militias didn't win because they were more primitive than the armies they faced. They won because they were operating under different constraints and had optimized for those constraints more effectively. Ukraine isn't winning by being less advanced than Russia. Ukraine is winning by using advanced technology within the framework of frontier military principles. They're using satellite imagery provided by NATO, they're using encrypted communications, they're using precision drone strikes. But they're doing all of this while maintaining resilience, distributed redundancy, local adaptation. The same principles that allowed colonial militias to defeat professional armies 2 centuries ago. The weapon systems themselves don't matter nearly as much as how they're integrated into a larger doctrine. Technological advantage that requires intact supply lines, stable electrical grids, uninterrupted communications networks, constant logistical support is not actually an advantage. It's a vulnerability. This is what peer competitors and near-peer competitors have weaponized, targeting not the weapons systems themselves, but the infrastructure required to maintain them. China's anti-ship ballistic missile strategy isn't about sinking carriers. It's about making carrier battle groups too expensive to operate in contested waters. Russia's targeting of Ukrainian power infrastructure isn't primarily about discomfort. It's about breaking down the distributed network that allows Ukrainian forces to function. They understand that the system is more vulnerable than any single component. What this means operationally is that military planning is shifting in ways that most defense analysis hasn't caught up to. The armies that are reorganizing around small unit effectiveness, Distributed ammunition stocks, redundant command and control, acceptance of equipment losses are the ones that will dominate future conflicts. The armies that are still optimized for centralized planning, supply line efficiency, and equipment preservation are going to encounter problems they didn't anticipate. Japan's self-defense forces have been quietly reorganizing around this principle for the past 5 years, distributing ammunition stocks across hundreds of small locations instead of maintaining centralized depots, training small unit leaders to operate independently for weeks without higher command contact. They're investing in robust small-scale manufacturing rather than just acquisition of major platforms. These aren't the actions of a military planning to win a short war. These are the actions of a military planning to endure a long one. The implications for other regional powers are obvious. Taiwan's entire defense strategy has shifted in the last 2 years toward distributed small unit operations, local fortification, and acceptance of conventional military inferiority. They're not trying to win a naval battle against China, trying to make an invasion of the island so costly, so prolonged, and so uncertain that it becomes strategically unfeasible. Every tunnel system they build, every distributed command post, every small militia unit trained in local defense represents a principle drawn directly from frontier military doctrine. Make yourself expensive to defeat rather than trying to achieve battlefield superiority. Here's what's genuinely alarming to conventional military planners. This doctrine is cheaper, more resilient, actually more sustainable than centralized military organization. A distributed militia can operate on less than a tenth of the logistics budget of a conventional military force. This isn't just theoretically true, we're observing it in real time. Russia has mobilized over 600,000 troops in the Ukraine conflict. That's not sustainable for the Russian economy long term, but Russia has already demonstrated it's willing to accept massive losses and restructure its economy entirely around a war that conventional economic analysis said should have been impossible. Why? Because they're willing to accept inefficiency, loss, disruption as operational features rather than bugs that need to be fixed. The inversion of the traditional military power calculus means that the next phase of geopolitical competition isn't going to look like the conflicts we've studied. It's not going to be about force projection and technological dominance. It's going to be about who can absorb the most disruption, who can operate most effectively when supply chains fail, who has restructured